Welcome to an Explain Everything presentation. This presentation is on diplomacy during the Van Buren, Harrison, and Tyler administrations. Really, Van Buren and Tyler administrations. Harrison was only president for about a month. So we want to explore several incidents and one major treaty. One of the things to realize at the time period in the late 1830s, early 1840s, is that this was a period when there was some significant tension between the United States and Great Britain that came close to leading the nations to war. The first incident we want to explore is the Caroline affair. The Caroline was a ship, you see it depicted in the picture on the left, burning. This incident began December 29, 1837, where residents of the eastern provinces of Canada had launched a rebellion against British colonial government. They chartered an American steamship, the Caroline, to transport supplies across the Niagara River from New York. British, Canadian, and militiamen crossed to the American side of the river, seized the ship, set it on fire, set it ablaze and adrift, in the process killing one American, a man by the name of Amos Durfee, on New York soil. A Canadian steamship, the Sir Robert Peel, was seized and torched on the St. Lawrence River in retaliation. And as tensions grew, secret hunters' lodges, as they were called, formed to assist in the independence of Canada by Americans. President Van Buren declared neutrality in this conflict, but he did send General Winfield Scott to take command of U.S. forces on the border, just-in-case precaution. The British, however, refused to disavow the Caroline attack or provide compensation. In the meantime, New York State officials arrested Canadian Alexander McLeod and charged him with the murder of Amos Durfee in the Caroline affair, the man who was killed on American soil. The British were pretty outraged by this and insisted that Alexander McLeod could not be tried for murder since he was acting under official orders in a military capacity. Lord Palmerston, British minister, demanded McLeod's release and saying his execution, since he was on trial for a capital crime, would bring, in Palmerston's words, immediate and frightful war. Secretary of State Daniel Webster said that he could not intervene, being held by state court on state charges, though Webster did not think that this was worthy of a war. Palmerston doesn't really understand the federalism and the difference between the federal courts and state courts. They don't really understand that a federal official could not intervene in this state legal matter if they wanted to, but the crisis was diffused when the New York jury did acquit McLeod. The second incident we want to explore was the Aroostook War in 1838 and 39. This was a brief border conflict between the United States and Canada over the main Canadian border. I try to mention it as often as possible, of course, because it's so much fun to say Aroostook, and the war involved lumberjacks, and who couldn't love that? We see a cartoon portrayed on screen, a little pun with the main question Van Buren portrayed within the cartoon. In 1838, Americans and Canadians, mostly lumberjacks, moved into the area of the Aroostook River on the main Canadian border. Both groups claimed the area, and violent brawls began to break out. On February 12, 1839, Canadian lumberjacks arrested Rufus McIntyre, a land agent appointed by Maine Governor John Fairfield to help expel the Canadian lumberjacks from the area. In March, late March, an agreement was worked out by General Winfield Scott and Lieutenant Governor Sir John Harvey of New Brunswick that the British would not use force to occupy the Aroostook region, and Governor Fairfield would allow the British to retain some settlements on the St. Lawrence River. this agreement really does not settle definitively the border issues. The border was finally finalized in the Webster-Ashburn Treaty of 1842. The United States got just over half of the disputed territory, and we'll explore that treaty in a few moments. The next incident we want to talk about is the Creole incident. The Creole was also a ship. It was an American ship. In 1841, the Creole set sail from Virginia to New Orleans with more than 100 slaves on board. Remember that while the foreign slave trade had been banned, this was just internal domestic slave trade. En route, however, the slaves rebelled and took the ship and sailed to the Bahamas seeming to them a much better destination than slave market in New Orleans. British officials in the Bahamas then claimed that the slaves were free, and the British government refused to overrule them. Americans, particularly Southerners, were quite upset by this. Not all Americans were upset. Joshua Giddings, a Whig from Ohio, a member of the House of Representatives, offered a resolution as Secretary of State Webster went to the Bahamas to try to reclaim the slaves. Giddings introduced a resolution in Congress. Giddings was an abolitionist. Giddings' resolution would claim that Negroes on the high seas were under federal, not slave state jurisdiction, and the United States was not justified in demanding their return as property. But slavery, by this point, was a very sensitive issue in Congress, stirring very heated sectional feelings, and as a result of simply offering that resolution, the House of Representatives censured Giddings, and he resigned his seat, though he was immediately reelected to Congress and continued to serve until 1859. The British eventually agreed to pay $110,330 to the United States as compensation, and to agree that the forcible seizure of a ship on the seas would not suspend U.S. laws. The Creole incident might remind some of you of the Amistad. Some of you may be familiar with that. There's a fairly major Steven Spielberg movie made of the Amistad incident several years ago. But the Creole incident does have some differences from the Amistad. Amistad incident occurred in 1839 and then brought to the Supreme Court in 1841. The Amistad was a Spanish ship, a slave ship, and slaves rebelled. It was captured by American ships when it was basically adrift off of Long Island, the slaves not being able to pilot the ships. Some prominent Americans took up this case, including John Quincy Adams, got involved in it. It eventually went before the court as slaves sought their freedom through the judicial system, and they were granted their freedom by the court. But it's a fairly narrow decision that would not have a lot of implications for American slaves, because the court ruled that the slaves on the Amistad who had mutinied were freed because it was a Spanish ship, and slavery was illegal under Spanish law by that point, and so they were never legally enslaved under Spanish law, and therefore, did not remain enslaved because they were never legally enslaved to begin with. A very good result for the folks aboard the Amistad, but not one that had huge implications for legal victories for American slaves. And finally, we want to discuss the Webster-Ashburn Treaty of 1842. The Webster is Daniel Webster, American Secretary of State. He was hanging around in John Tyler's cabinet, and as we will see, Tyler had some significant political problems. Most of his cabinet would resign, but Webster stayed on at least long enough to finish the negotiations. Ashburn is the British foreign minister. The treaty concerns border issues primarily between the United States and Canada, though as we will see it addresses several other significant issues. One of the primary issues negotiated in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty were borders between the United States um, and Canada. You see on the map areas in dispute in northern Maine, the United States claiming all of the territory, the British claiming then about the upper, let's call it third or so of today what is Maine, and then there is some disputed territory out on the northwestern shores of Lake Superior. Now, in regard to the borders in Maine, that theoretically had already been settled as a result of the Peace of Paris and the Treaty of Paris of 1783, ending the American Revolution. And interestingly, both parties had documents from the 1783 negotiations of that treaty that would seem to indicate what the border actually was. Webster had a map in his possession from those negotiations, which he believed to be authentic, that indicated that the entire disputed area properly belonged to Canada. Ashburn had in his possession a map which he believed to be authentic from the 1783 negotiations, which indicated that the entire disputed area properly belonged to the United States. Neither one of them felt the need to make their map known to the other side. So, potentially they're both negotiating in bad faith from what they believe should have been settled by the 1783 treaty. The disputed area in Maine is the same area in the Aroostook Valley that was disputed during the Aroostook War. As a result of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, that area is settled. You see the current borders by the green line, current borders of Maine. So we don't recover all of that territory in Maine, but a good chunk, and then the border to the west of Lake Superior, and split not quite down the middle, but in the territory that the United States retains, and there are some important iron ore deposits that become important to industrial development in the United States later. While the Webster-Ashburton Treaty is remembered primarily for settling the Canada-Maine boundary issues, there are some additional provisions of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. It's important that we be aware of them. College Board has a nasty habit of asking questions about the Webster-Ashburton Treaty that don't turn on the border incidents. Settled the border issues as shown in the map in the previous slide. Additionally, in regard to the Caroline incident, the British express regret for destruction of the Caroline. In regard to the Creole incidents, the British agree to avoid interference in freeing slaves in similar cases. The United States and Great Britain agreed to cooperate in naval exercises in patrolling the African coast to suppress the illegal slave trade. The British have, by this point, banned slavery. America obviously had not, but had, at this point for quite some time, banned the foreign slave trade. But there's still smuggling going on there, and so they agreed to cooperate in trying to suppress that, and that would also help prevent future incidents like the Creole. The United States and Great Britain further agreed to cooperate on extradition of criminals So this would include U.S. criminals fleeing into Canada, British holding, or vice versa. So for a fairly straightforward legal arrangement there. Now, there are issues over the Oregon Territory. Now, you'll recall back to Rush-Bagot and Convention of 1818 that we had agreed on joint occupation for 10 years, which was renewed. We know the time is coming, and probably closer in the future, when some settlement will have to be made in regard to Oregon. The settlement there was increasing. But it wasn't so pressing that it had to be decided right then in 1842. It was a potentially contentious issue that they probably would not have been able to settle, so they decided just to continue with the status quo of joint occupation so as to not let the Oregon issue scuttle their other agreements from the Webster-Ashburton Treaty and just push that into the future for when it would have to be dealt with, and it would be dealt with in the decade of the 1840s. So that wraps up for now our look at these diplomatic issues from Van Buren to Tyler.